past 24 hours have seen a bevy of Supreme Court decisions that affect the state of our democracy and a presidential debate that also affects the future of our democracy. So, here to break it all down for us is Skye Perryman. She is the president and CEO of Democracy Forward, an organization that, as you might guess, protects the state of democracy. Skye, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so there's a lot to break down on the Supreme Court front, but this morning everyone is talking about the presidential debate between President Biden and former President Donald Trump. Broadly speaking, did you think that the issues most affecting the state of the country were addressed last night?
Certainly there were many issues that were addressed last night that we know are fundamental to democracy, such as reproductive health care access, child care, and our overall system of democracy, our elections. But I do think that the debate did not really dive into some of the real extreme threats that we're seeing with respect to things like Project 2025 and other plans that are circulating around now to undermine our overall democracy.
Now, of course, a debate is not the best format for going into the details. I know at one point President Biden addressed rising rents, and it was a fast line. And as a renter myself, I wanted him to go back and go into detail there. But what issues or questions would you have wanted to see happen last night?
I think I would have wanted to see more questions about how our government is going to be able to deliver for the American people. There are right now plans circulating in Project 2025, which is a 900-page document that's been put out by the Heritage Foundation and a lot of aligned, pretty far-right interests that are proposing things like seeking to undermine our federal civil service and the workers that work throughout the country to deliver services to the American people, to blacklist and replace those civil servants that swear an oath to the Constitution with partisan loyalists with extreme ideologies. I think we did hear some discussion on reproductive rights and health care, but this is a year where we're having a presidential election after there has been a rollback of the fundamental rights of half of the population and of people. And so would have wanted to hear, more discussion on that.
You mentioned contraception, and that is a perfect transition to some of the decisions from the Supreme Court that we have seen this term. You, Skye, have served as legal counsel on some of these cases. Let's start with the most recent one. SCOTUS issued an opinion on the Idaho abortion ban yesterday, or kind of a partial opinion if you listen to Justice Jackson and her dissent. But break down for us, what did the Supreme Court decide when it comes to emergency abortions in Idaho?
Well, the Supreme Court yesterday decided to lift a stay that it itself put in place that prevented women in Idaho from being able to receive federally protected emergency care under a law that is known, that it's abbreviated INTALA, but it is a federal law that enables all people, including pregnant people, to obtain emergency care when they need it. And there have been extreme attacks, such as the ban in Idaho that bans abortion in instances where people need an abortion in an emergency situation at an emergency room to protect their health. And so the Supreme Court yesterday, the result of its order is that women in Idaho will be able to receive that federally protected emergency care. However, what the Supreme Court did not do, and what it should have done, is to unequivocally state that state abortion bans like Idaho's that prevent people from seeking emergency care in an emergency abortion care are unlawful. And because the Supreme Court did not unequivocally state that, and it sort of kicked the can down the road, it essentially dismissed the petition that was before it, that it itself granted, saying that they made a mistake, but now has left open the possibility that either with respect to the Idaho case or with respect to a case in Texas or in other states, that it would that those cases would come back up to the court, and that the court might shut the door on this federally protected emergency care. And so it is a very disappointing decision. It is good that women in Idaho will be able to obtain some level of emergency care. Of course, the only reason that they were not able to obtain that is because the Supreme Court stayed a lower court's order that was enabling them to, that had found that the Idaho ban was unlawful because of these issues. So the Supreme Court sought to correct that, I guess, in the near term, but is really avoiding the broader issue. And what this means is that reproductive rights are still being threatened throughout the country. This does not provide any certainty for people in other states like Texas that are continuing to be deprived of emergency care.
So there are a lot of legal mechanisms that you referenced in your answer right there. But for folks who want to know if they can get care in Idaho, the takeaway is that if they are pregnant and they are experiencing a medical emergency that would require an abortion, as of yesterday, the court is allowing them to receive that. But future challenges to Idaho law could undo what the court just did.
Yeah, so if it sounds confusing, that's because what the court has been doing on abortion is confusing. And it's that's a purpose of a lot of this extreme behavior, is to confuse people. So I'll break it down really simply. In Idaho, the abortion ban that prevents people from receiving care in the ER to protect their health, if that care requires an abortion. Right now, there is a federal court order from a lower federal court that is in effect that says that part of the ban is unlawful and that women can obtain that care. That's what the Supreme Court essentially allowed to go into effect yesterday, after it had stopped that protection for people for a period of 6 months. The problem with what the Supreme Court did yesterday is that it did not say unequivocally that the Idaho ban was in fact unlawful. It did not address this issue with respect to other states, and it essentially avoided those issues, which, as Justice Jackson pointed out in her dissent, means that women across the country continue to, and healthcare providers across the country continue to exist in a state of uncertainty, a state of chaos. And of course, we know from the stories in Texas and the accounts in Florida and other places that women are continuing to be deprived of emergency care. Yesterday, the court's order did not change that at all.
I'm glad you mentioned Justice Jackson's dissent, because at face value, if you're looking at the headlines a little quickly, you know that she's a member of the more liberal wing of the court. So to hear she wrote a dissent in this case, I think is another aspect of this that might be confusing. But essentially, is it fair to say that her dissent was telling the court, hey, we should have been clearer on this. We should have set a more forward precedent?
Right. I mean, what she's objecting to is the fact that all the court did yesterday was dismiss a petition that it itself took and lifted a stay that it itself put in place. And it is not addressing the underlying crisis in this country, which is that there are extreme organizations and states that are seeking to deprive women who are pregnant of emergency care that federal law requires that they receive. The court evaded that issue. You could say the court potentially wanted to maybe evade accountability in a year as momentous as this presidential election year. Might be one way to look at that. But the court evaded that issue, did not resolve that issue, which means that women and their doctors throughout the country continue to exist in a state of confusion, or worse, in places like Texas, in a state where they're not able to provide or get the care they need. However, for women that are in Idaho who had not been able to access medical emergency care as a result of the Supreme Court's own prior stay, the court did lift that yesterday.
The court also dismissed a challenge to the FDA's certification approval of the drug mifepristone, which is used in medication abortions. Do these dual decisions signal to you, Skye, that the court just doesn't want to decide on abortion beyond what it did 2 years ago with Dobbs?
Well, I think we've seen what these two decisions are saying is that the court certainly doesn't want to decide anything that it perceives will outrage the public, particularly this year. But both in the EMTALA, the medical abortion decision and in the mifepristone decision, the court did not decide any issue on the merits, and so this continues to sow uncertainty in communities across the country. What the court did in the mifepristone case was to say unequivocally that the case never belonged in the courts, that the plaintiffs in that case had no standing. But this highlights another problem that we have, which is that extremists are seeking to use our courts in ways that are improper. They shouldn't be in the courts. And in doing that, put mifepristone access at jeopardy for over a year, where medical professionals, patients did not know whether that medication was going to be available because of the tactics that they used in handpicking a judge, in filing a case, in going to the Fifth Circuit, and of course all the resources that had to be expended to fight that battle when the Supreme Court said in a 9-0 decision this case should have never even been in the courts to begin with.
It's interesting that you mentioned the confusion that has been sown. There was a report from JAMA, a leading medical journal, earlier this week showing that contraceptive access in states with abortion ban is down, and down more than what you'd expect if people were just getting longer forms of birth control, like an IUD, right? And so the authors of this study basically said there are fewer clinics operating in states with bans, but also there's general confusion among the populace about what is legal, what reproductive health can I access, and where can I access it. Is that consistent with what you're seeing?
Yes, I mean, and that's a real concern, because what we know is that these extreme groups that are behind cases like Dobbs, behind the mifepristone case, behind challenges to federal emergency care, what they want to do is to confuse people, to make care inaccessible, and to create a situation where people cannot access the care they need, either because there's not appropriate information, because they live in a banned state and maybe don't have the resources to travel to a place where the care is lawful. And so we're continuing to see harms from Dobbs. And those harms, unfortunately, did not get alleviated in this court term. The court had the opportunity to once and for all settle some of these matters, and instead it just kicked the can down the road. And so many people and many women across the country will continue to live in uncertainty and to face real harm, like the women in Texas who continue to be deprived of emergency care, even in very dire situations.
Are there other cases on the horizon, either this term or next term, that stand to provide further clarity on America's reproductive health laws?
Well, there are attacks coming every day in courts across the country, and some of those will make their way to the Supreme Court. On the question of emergency care, there's a case in Texas right now that the Department of Justice has had to appeal to the Supreme Court, and so that petition for cert before the Supreme Court is pending, and the state's answer is due soon. And so I do think that we'll continue to see these cases, and what we have seen with this court is, unfortunately, at times a trend where they avoid an issue during a year where they think everyone is paying attention, and then maybe come back and then seek to deprive people of their rights in times where they perceive that maybe there is less at stake. And so it's really important that we remain vigilant, that your viewers and those that listen to your programming sort of remain vigilant and highlighting these threats that we're seeing every day.
Now, obviously, Democracy Forward looks at a number of issues and not just abortion. So I want to make sure we spend a few minutes on the Supreme Court decisions that were released this morning. There were a number of them. What stands out to you? Is there one or two that everyone should know the top line takeaways for?
Absolutely. I would want your viewers to know about the two cases that were decided this morning, called Loper Bright and Relentless. They deal with what some people may think is a very wonky issue, but it's a really fundamental issue for all of us as Americans, because they deal with the way that our government operates to protect and serve the people in this country. This morning, the court overturned 40 years worth of precedent in these cases and made it harder for our federal system to deliver for people. It essentially overturned a legal principle that stands for the proposition that when Congress passes a law and federal agencies are entrusted to implement that law, whether that is, worker protections, anti-discrimination protections, food and drug safety laws that the FDA, like mifepristone or other things, that those agencies are accorded some deference when people seek to challenge their actions in court. Of course, we know agencies can't act unlawfully, and there are a number of challenges that might be appropriate. But for 40 years in this country, courts have generally deferred to the subject matter experts and to the agencies on certain questions. Today, the court dealt the American people a blow by overturning that precedent. And that essentially means that you will see more litigation, likely more litigation like the one we've seen on mifepristone, where special interests file in their hand-picked court and seek to undermine the FDA or undermine other federal agencies' abilities and expertise and abilities to deliver for people. So we're watching that one really closely. Of interest to your Forbes viewers, we represented more than 200 organizations that represented more than 250,000 small businesses, who were very concerned that if the court did what it did this morning, that this would really unsettle their ability to grow and thrive and compete because of the chaos that this decision could sow. So that's one to definitely know about.
Skye, thank you so much for breaking that down for us. There is so much more to come, and we hope to have you back to explain it more as the days and weeks unfold. But for the meantime,
Always love joining you.
thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.